Well, good evening to you all. So as Dr. Zimmer said, my name is Carlo Broussard, and that last name is Cajun. Yes, it is. If you hear me speak a little funny every once in a while, that's because I'm from southern Louisiana. I am a transplant. I am a fish out of water, right? But I work for an organization called Catholic Answers, Catholic.com, stationed down in El Cajon, where our headquarters are. And we're basically a media ministry that's dedicated to defending and explaining the Catholic faith, whether we're dialoguing with atheists and agnostics, skeptics to Christianity, Protestants, Jews, Muslims. We exist to produce materials, and with our Catholic Answers live radio program every day from 3 to 5, we take live calls, and we exist to give answers, persuasive answers, intellectually, biblically, in order to explain why we believe what we believe as Catholics. So I would highly encourage you to check us out at Catholic.com. For myself, I come, as I mentioned, from southern Louisiana. I come from a musical background. I was pursuing a promising musical career down in South Louisiana, performing on stage from the time I was 13 in the bars to the nightclubs when I was 18, 19. Gave it up at 20 in order to pursue a newfound dream of Catholic apologetics. And so for Catholic Answers, I am a full-time apologist. So I do go around apologizing for the Catholic faith. But if you know the Greek term from which that word apology comes, you understand what I'm talking about, because apology comes from the Greek word apologia, which literally means an intellectual answer, an intellectual defense. So I travel the country giving lectures in various venues in order to give intellectual and persuasive answers to questions that arise concerning our Catholic faith in particular, and even our Christian faith in general, and even those various truths that we hold that go beyond the boundaries of Christianity that others may hold as well, such as God's existence, etc. What we call in theology and philosophy the preambles of faith, those things that we can know by the natural light of human reason. So that's what I do as an apologist. We write books and we contribute to our magazine. We have an online magazine, and so that's basically what I do and what we do as an apostolate at Catholic Answers. So once again, Catholic.com. Now, the title of my presentation this evening is Defending Truth Against Relativism. And I suspect that many of you sort of have somewhat of an inclination or an idea of what relativism might be, because apparently that topic has drawn you here this evening to discuss and to think about truth in relation to a popular worldview known as relativism. Now, relativism comes in many different shapes and sizes. So what I want to do first tonight is to make some distinctions about relativism, because as I mentioned, it comes in many different shapes and forms. Secondly, once we understand the broad categories of relativism, I'm going to critique certain forms of relativism that we often encounter in our conversations with people. And then third, I want to counter some arguments that relativists often pose to us in support of the different forms of relativism. So basically, fundamentally, we're going to do a critique and then a counter. So that's sort of the lay of the land and where I want to go in this evening's presentation. Now, I will say this at the outset and preface my remarks by saying we will be doing some intellectual calisthenics, all right? It will be a bit of a challenge, perhaps, to stretch the intellect a bit in order to philosophize, right? We're going to be doing a little philosophy tonight. And that's a good thing. You know why? Because as a rational animal, right, we are human beings, we cannot help but philosophize. You can only do it well or poorly, right? Because even the statement, as Dr. Hawking, the late, God rest his soul, the late Dr. Hawking stated in his 2010 Grand Design book, philosophy is dead. Even if you try to deny philosophy as a legitimate means by which we come to know reality, you're doing philosophy. You cannot deny philosophy without doing philosophy in order to deny it. Do you follow me? Because to make the conclusion philosophy is dead, you're presupposing certain premises that you're basing your conclusion on, and that's just doing philosophy. So as human beings, as rational animals, we can't help but do philosophy. We can't help but do philosophy. We can only do it poorly or do it well. So what are the distinctions of relativism? Well, there are two broad categories of relativism, one of which is called global relativism or total relativism. Global or total, and I'll just go with total relativism for brevity's sake. Total relativism involves relativistic claims about truth in general. So no matter what we're talking about, whether human nature, morality, religion, and just reality itself, total relativism states there is no absolute truth. Truth is relative to what you think or what I think, or what a group of individuals happens to think. There is no truth, no reality independent of what you or I happen to think. That's total relativism. It's a denial, a negation of truth, absolutely speaking, truth in general. Now, the other broad category of relativism is what is known as partial relativism. Because some will say, well, of course there's some absolute truth. I'm not going to deny that. But truth is relative when it comes to morality, say, or when it comes to religion. So notice how it's a partial version of relativism, saying, for example, that truth is relative when it pertains to morality. So therefore, there are no absolute moral truths. Moral truth is relative to what you or I happen to think. So you may think same-sex sexual activity is immoral, and that might be immoral for you, but not for me. You may think fornication is immoral, but not for me. So this would be partial, a version or a type of partial relativism, namely moral relativism. And these are the two types of relativism that I want to critique tonight. I want to share with you how we can critique global or total relativism, and then transition to critiquing moral relativism in particular. And there's even a version, a partial version of moral relativism that I would like to reflect upon tonight, and that is, well, maybe there are some absolute moral truths, like when it involves other people. But moral truths, when it only involves me, that's not absolute, that's relative. So you just do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anybody, right? So that's yet another type of relativism. It's a partial form of moral relativism that I would like to reflect upon as well. So let's dive right in. And let's talk about total relativism. Now recall, total relativism is the philosophical worldview that there is no absolute truth. So how do we respond to that? Well, the first way that we can respond, our first strategy, is to show that it's self-defeating, it's self-referentially incoherent, it's self-refuting. In other words, for you old rock and roll fans, the relativist, this global relativist that's asking us to take a ride on this magic carpet ride, he's pulling it out from underneath our feet once we get on it, right? And here's how we can show how it's self-refuting. We can simply ask, is that absolutely true? Because the belief is there is no absolute truth. To which we could respond and say, is that absolutely true? Now, if our total relativist friend says, yes, it's absolutely true that there is no absolute truth, well then, there's at least one absolute truth, namely, there is no absolute truth. But if there's at least one absolute truth, well then, total relativism is false. Did you follow that? If you didn't catch it, you might have to get my book, Prepare the Way, Overcoming Obstacles to God, the Gospel, and the Church. And even if you did catch it, still get my book. Now, moreover, to say that it's absolutely true that there is no absolute truth, that violates a fundamental principle of reason known as the principle of non-contradiction. You ever heard of that? Maybe you took a philosophy class in college or something. The principle of non-contradiction states that something cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same place and time. My friend here cannot be sitting and not sitting in the same respect at the same place and time. She is actually sitting. She has the potential to not sit, but inasmuch as she is sitting, she cannot be not sitting in the same respect, the same place and time, right? So to say it's absolutely true that there is no absolute truth is to violate the principle of non-contradiction. And thus, inasmuch as total relativism is false, inasmuch as the statement there is no absolute truth is self-referentially incoherent and thus unreasonable, the opposite must be true. The opposite, namely, there is absolute truth, must be true. Because we've proven total relativism, there is no absolute truth to be false. Therefore, the opposite must be true. It's either A or not A, right? And you eliminate one, the other must be true. So inasmuch as we can refute total relativism and prove it to be false, we've already demonstrated by the natural light of human reason that truth must exist. There must be some, whatever that truth is, we don't know yet. That we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and do a lot more work to figure that out. But that there is an objective reality for the mind to come to know, independent of my ideas and what I think. That's the stepping stone and the first step that we must take as rational animals in our philosophical inquiry. Now, my total relativist friend might say, well, Carlo, the belief there is no absolute truth, well, it's not absolutely true, it's only relatively true. But, ladies and gentlemen, inasmuch as you use the verb is to say that total relativism is relatively true, you're making the second act of the intellect, known as the act of judgment, which necessarily is a claim about objective reality. So once again, the total relativist finds himself in a contradiction because he's saying there's at least one absolute truth, namely, total relativism is relatively true. And once again, it involves a violation of the principle of non-contradiction. So, total relativism is bankrupt, and it does not stand up to the scrutiny of reason. Okay. I could see somebody, and many people will say, okay, well, Carlo, that's absurd to say that there is no absolute truth, to which I would respond and say, well, there are a lot of people who actually believe that. But our friend might say, okay, well, I acknowledge that there are some absolute truths, but there's no absolute truth when it comes to morality. And to state there is no absolute moral truth, that's not self-referentially incoherent. That is not self-refuting in the statement itself. there is no absolute moral truths, because the individual is allowing for some absolute truths, and this belief about moral relativism is absolutely true, and that's fine. The intellect can concede that and see that as reasonable. That's coherent. But just because moral relativism is not self-refuting like total relativism, that doesn't mean it's not problematic, all right? It does suffer from several pitfalls. What are we talking about? Moral relativism. The worldview that states there are no absolute moral truths. So moral truth is relative to what you or I happen to think. There is no absolute morality independent of what you or I happen to think, or a group of individuals. So how can we respond to moral relativism? And by the way, Dr. Zimmer, I forgot to take your phone, so I'm flying blind here on the time. So you might have to just help me out and let me know when I got like 15 minutes left or something, okay? So what about moral relativism? Well, here we go. Let's think about this. The moral relativist is going to have to affirm either one of two positions. Either A, he's going to have to say, we ought to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism, or we don't have to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism. Because remember, the moral relativist is saying it's absolutely true. I'm describing the way things really are in reality. Namely, there's no absolute moral truth. Okay, if that's the case, I would simply ask you, ought I to live in accord with that truth? Yes or no? Now, the moral relativist is not going to want to say, no, you don't have to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism. Why wouldn't he say that? Because there would be no point in making the assertion in the first place. Why would you even assert that moral truths are relative if you're not going to expect people to live in accord with it? That doesn't make sense. And secondly, moreover, if I don't have to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism, well then what you're saying is that I don't have to live in accord with reality the way that I know what is real. I don't have to live in accord with what I know is real. But isn't that the essence of insanity? To live your life in accord, to live your life in a way that you know is not in accord with what is real. So the moral relativist does not want to answer the question in the negative. The question being, should I live in accord with moral relativism or not? He doesn't want to say no in answering that question. So let's consider the other option. Maybe our friend says, yes, you should live in accord with the truth of moral relativism. Can anybody see the problem in that statement? You ought to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism. That implies at least one absolute moral truth, does it not? Namely, you ought to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism. Well, if that's the case, if there's at least one absolute moral truth, namely, you ought to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism, well then, guess what? Moral relativism is false. Right? So it implies at least one absolute moral truth. So inasmuch as the moral relativist affirms that we should live in accord with the truth of moral relativism, there he is pulling the rug out from underneath his feet. The affirmation that we ought to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism is self-refuting. Consider furthermore, if the moral relativist says, yes, we ought to live in accord with the truth of moral relativism, well then, ladies and gentlemen, that makes it impossible to make any form of negative moral evaluations. For example, if Jack rapes Jane, and moral relativism is true, that's the way things really are when it comes to morality, well then I cannot reasonably criticize Jack for what he's doing to Jane and say that is wrong, that is immoral. Why? Because according to the mental framework of moral relativism, raping Jane could be perceived as a legitimate good for Jack. And if Jack believes his action is good for him, and moral relativism is true, well then I cannot reasonably criticize Jack and say that act is immoral. All I can say is I don't like that act. All I can say as a moral relativist is Jack's belief runs contrary to my feelings and my personal preferences. Jack's moral belief is contradicts and is contrary to my moral belief. But why should Jack care about what I believe? He doesn't seem the type of person that's going to give a flip about what other people think or feel, given the action that he's performing. Does that make sense? So not only is the affirmation of that we should live in accord with moral relativism self-refuting, the affirmation that we should live in accord with moral relativism actually runs contrary to the grain of even our intuitions as human beings that, no, that action, that's objectively, absolutely immoral. And thus, I can judge that act to be immoral. If you're willing to embrace moral relativism, you cannot make such a judgment. So a moral relativist has to make a choice. Either the moral relativist keeps the judgment that Jack's act or behavior of raping Jane is immoral. Either he has to accept that and reject relativism, moral relativism that is, or he's going to have to, if he wants to keep his relativism, his moral relativism, he's going to have to reject the possibility of making negative moral evaluations in all forms. He can't have both, right? So he either has to reject moral relativism in order to keep his negative moral evaluation of rape, or he's going to have to reject the negative moral evaluation of rape in order to keep his moral relativism. Does that make sense? I actually got it clear on that try. I messed it up the first time if you didn't notice. So this is how we can critique. Now, there are many more ways in which we can critique moral relativism. In fact, many scholars have written a plethora of books on it, but one that I would recommend to you is written by the scholars Francis Beckwith and Gregory Kokel in their book, Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Mid-Air. And they do a fine job of critiquing relativism in all of its different forms, okay? So that's how I would critique moral relativism. Now, perhaps our friend will say, well, Carlo, I recognize that there are some absolute moral truths, but morality is, I'll concede that morality is absolute when it involves other people. Morality is absolute when behaviors cause unnecessary harm to other people. But morality is relative when it involves only myself and doesn't involve other people. So you might call this a partial relativism, right? It's a partial form of moral relativism. So how would we respond to this? Well, the first thing is, let's say for argument's sake that there is even such a thing as morality that could be merely personal and not involve other people in some way. So let's say, for argument's sake, there is such a thing as personal morality versus interpersonal morality, okay? There's some problems. We could even challenge this idea that personal morals or morality for an individual is relative. And here's how we could challenge even that idea. I would challenge the idea that personal morality is relative. Here's how I would do that. First of all, if morality is absolute, when it involves other human beings, and I am a human being, well then it's reasonable to conclude that morality would be absolute when it involves myself as well. Because I have a human nature, just like you guys have a human nature, right? And it's that nature that serves as an objective standard of determining what is good and what is bad for us, insofar as we are human beings. So, for example, as rational animals, as human beings, we are directed to know the truth. And inasmuch as we acquire truth, that is perfective of who we are as human beings. It's perfective of our nature. And since morality is all about doing good, avoiding evil, and I recognize pursuit of the truth is a good for me as a human being, then it's morally good to seek the truth and to embrace the truth when I find it. It's morally bad to stop someone from pursuing the truth, to stop someone from embracing the truth, such as lying to them. And notice that the standard by which I make these judgments applies to all of us in as much as we are human beings. So we can give good reasons to think that even if there is such a thing as personal morality, distinct from interpersonal morality, we can challenge the claim that personal morality is relative. No, it's not. We all have the same kind of nature, a human nature, and that determines what is good and bad for us insofar as we are human beings. We all are made for knowledge. We're all made for love. And those truths about who we are as human beings determines what's good, morally good for us and morally bad for us. So the claim that personal morality is relative, that doesn't stand up to the scrutiny of reason. There are absolute moral truths. Now, furthermore, consider this. I don't think many actually believe personal morality is relative in practice. I mean, are we really willing to say that when my neighbor intends to murder me, but by chance circumstances, he just so happens he can't carry the action out, are we willing to say that his choice to murder me was only morally true relative to him? Are we willing to say that his choice to murder me, even though he wasn't able to carry it out in practice, was not absolutely immoral? If we buy into this personal morality is relative versus interpersonal morality is absolute, we're going to have to say that my neighbor's choice to murder me was not absolutely wrong. But that seems to go contrary to our moral intuitions. No, if my neighbor intends to murder me and he just can't carry it out, we recognize that is absolutely wrong, even though it only involved himself. Does that make sense? Consider this. A creep who gratifies himself sexually with child pornography. Inasmuch as he's performing the act of viewing child pornography, there's no interpersonal relationships going on. It's only himself. Are we willing to say that his action is not absolutely wrong because it only involves himself, and when he engages in that behavior, no harm is being done to anybody else, we're going to have to conclude it's not absolutely wrong if we hold to this partial moral relativism. And finally, I would just say this. I don't think that we can actually make a distinction between personal morality and interpersonal morality. It seems very hard to even think of anything that a human being might believe or do and think that wouldn't affect other human beings at some point down the road. We are rational animals, as Aristotle said, but inasmuch as we are rational, we have reason and intellect and freedom, we are social animals. We live in society amongst other human beings. So what I think and what I do, even in my private life, is going to determine and affect me in ways that then I step out of the private sphere into the public sphere, and the actions and the ways of thinking form me in the private sphere, and that spills over into the public sphere and thus affects how I relate to other human beings. For example, a man who views pornography, it trains him to view the woman merely as a tool or object to be used to satisfy his own sexual gratification. It trains him to view the woman in such a way. So when he steps out the private sphere into the public sphere or the domain of interpersonal relationship, he's going to take with him the formation, the malformation that he obtained from his private actions, and thus begin viewing women in reality, not in virtual reality, but in reality, as objects to be used for his own self-gratification, rather than human beings to be reverenced and to be awed at. So I think we can challenge this idea that there is even such a thing as personal morality that's distinct from interpersonal morality. Because what we think and do in the private sphere forms us or malforms us, and we thus take that formation into the public sphere, and thus it affects the way we relate to other human beings. Now, that suffices for my brief comments, and I say brief because there's a whole lot more, folks. All right? Now, I'd like to transition to countering some of the arguments that relativists often pose to support their relativistic worldview. And these arguments, it's kind of hard to these arguments apply to both total relativism and moral relativism. But rather than trying to specify them, I'll just present the arguments and I'll try to highlight if it applies to one rather than the other. But for the most part, these arguments can be offered either both by the total relativists and the moral relativists. Argument number one: how can I believe in truth or moral truth, absolute truth or absolute moral truth, right? How can I believe in truth when people believe so many different things? I mean, don't you think if there was such a thing as absolute truth, well, then everybody would know it? Let's think about that. Should we conclude there is no absolute truth from the premise people have so many different beliefs about truth? I submit to you the answer is no. And here's the reason. It commits what we call in philosophy a non sequitur fallacy. Now, non sequitur is Latin for it does not follow. That's to say the conclusion, there is no absolute truth, doesn't follow from the premise people disagree about things. For example, many people in the past, and even unfortunately some people today, disagree about the shape of the earth. I was in the gym one afternoon working out, and I saw on the TV there, and it was like the sports talk show, and one of the dudes on the sports talk show was saying, "I believe the earth is flat." To which the two other people who were working with him said, "What high school did you go to, man?" Right? In the past, people legitimately disagreed about whether the earth was round, spherical, or flat. Does it follow from that disagreement that there is no objective truth about the shape of the earth? No, it doesn't. Just because people disagree about the shape of the earth, it doesn't follow from that there is no objective truth about the shape of the earth. If there were no objective truth about the shape of the earth, by golly, I don't think we'd be here right now, right? Or how about this example? Let's suppose we're driving down a long stretch road in the Arizona desert or something, and it's 125 degrees, right? And Father Bordas and I are in the car, and I'm like, "Father, I'm thirsty, man. I can't take it anymore." And I'm like, "Where's the water?" And Father Bordas says, "Carlo, I forgot it." No water, dying of thirst. I look ahead. I say, Father, there's water up ahead, man." Father Bordas says, "Carlo, that ain't water, bruh. That's a mirage." I say, "No, Father, it looks like water. Keep going. We're going to quench our thirst." We have a disagreement, do we not? Does it follow from that disagreement that there is no objective truth about the matter of whether it's a mirage or water? No, it doesn't follow. Similarly, the conclusion there is no objective truth doesn't follow from the premise that people have different beliefs about things. So that's how I would respond to the differing beliefs argument in support of relativism, whether it be total relativism or if we're talking about moral relativism, the same response would apply. Now, here's another response that only applies to moral relativism. Many will say, well, how could there be any absolute moral truth when people in various cultures have different moralities, different moral beliefs? And here's an example that Beckwith and Koch will bring up in their book, Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. They bring up the example, well, in India, it's immoral to eat cows. Whereas here in the United States, anybody had a cow mooing on their table tonight, right? She says, "No, I don't like the mooing kind," right? But here in the United States, here in the West, we have no problem eating cows. It would appear as if we have differing moral beliefs, right? But in reality, it's not the principle, it's not the moral principle that differs. It's our judgment about the facts that sort of supervene on the principles. The principle is, don't desecrate that which is sacred. The difference is in our judgment about what is sacred and what is not. I love a cow, me, right? That's Cajun, by the way. That's like broken English, okay? So our difference is in our judgment about the facts concerning what is sacred and what is not. But the moral principle, thou shalt not desecrate that which is sacred, remains the same. So often what you find when you analyze the differing moral beliefs among cultures, there's always an underlying moral principle that's the same. Honor is good. Courage is good. Bravery, love, knowledge, these are all considered good things cross-culturally. All human beings never say, "Cowardice is good. By golly, be a coward." No cultures say, we honor the brave, we honor the courageous. We don't honor the coward, right? So many times the differing moral beliefs are due to judgments about facts rather than the moral principles themselves. And furthermore, there are moral principles that transcend cultures that all human beings agree on. A couple of more arguments to counter here. How am I doing on time, Dr. Zimmer? I'm good? Okay. This is a biggie. The "thou shalt not judge" argument. The argument goes something like this. It's judgmental to say that someone's belief is false or someone's behavior is immoral. How do we respond? I mean, doesn't Jesus say in Matthew chapter 7, "Judge not lest ye be judged"? Yes, he does say that. But he's not saying we can't make a judgment about a belief or a behavior. Here's how I would respond. Let's say, for argument's sake, that we concede what the challenge or the objection understands judgmental to mean. Well, first of all, even before we go there, consider this. If we ought not to be judgmental, right? Doesn't that imply at least one absolute moral truth, that we ought not to be judgmental? And if there's at least one absolute moral truth, that we ought not to be judgmental, well then both total relativism and moral relativism is false. So that's the first way in which I would respond. But let's say, for argument's sake, that we concede the challenge's understanding of judgmental to mean we ought not to judge a belief to be false or a behavior to be immoral. On that supposition, here's how I would respond. First of all, I would say, aren't you being a bit inconsistent with your moral principle of thou shalt not judge? Because inasmuch as you tell me that I ought not to judge a belief to be false or a behavior to be immoral, aren't you judging my belief to be wrong? Did you catch that? In other words, you're saying I'm wrong for saying somebody else is wrong. Well, why can you say somebody's wrong, but I can't? Do you see the inconsistency there? There's a double principle. So the person who uses the judgmental argument is actually doing the very thing that he or she says we ought not to do, namely judge a belief to be false or a behavior to be immoral. And furthermore, I think it's practically impossible for us to suspend all judgments whatsoever. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, if we could not make any judgments about a belief to be false or a behavior to be immoral, well then, we couldn't function as human beings, because it belongs to our nature as human beings to make judgments. It's the very nature of the mind to make a judgment about the way things really are, and to direct our lives in accord with what we know about the way things really are. We cannot help but make judgments about whether a belief is in conformity with reality or a behavior is in conformity with what's good for us as a human being. So I submit that it's practically impossible to not judge a belief to be false, true or false, or a behavior to be immoral. But notice that these responses are on the supposition that to be judgmental means to judge a belief to be false and a behavior to be immoral. If my relativist friend thinks being judgmental means you ought not to judge the motives of the person, the motives behind why they believe such a thing or why they do such a thing. If that's what my relativist friend means, that we ought not to judge the motives, well then I agree 100%. Because as St. Thomas Aquinas put it in the Summa Theologiae, we are not in a position to judge the inner movements of the heart. And I think this is what people mean when they say, don't judge me. You don't know anything about me. And there's a kernel of truth in that we are not to judge the motives behind the action or behind the belief. We can judge objectively, this belief doesn't conform to reality. That behavior is immoral. But what we cannot judge in ordinary circumstances are the inner motives behind the action or the belief, because only God has access to that subjective level of the human being. So we agree that we ought not to judge the person because we can't judge the reasons why the person is believing X or doing Y. Does that make sense? And I think if we can share that with our friends in conversation, we can gain a lot of ground there because there is something we can agree on. And once you can agree on something, then that helps the dialogue. That helps the conversation. It brings down barriers. So once my friend realizes I'm not judging her or him and his motives, and like I'm not saying, you're going to hell for doing this. I don't know. I can say, this action could possibly lead you to hell if you commit it with full knowledge and deliberate consent. But whether or not this person has full knowledge and has deliberate consent, I can't judge that. And this gets back to what Jesus was saying. If I can just bring in Jesus a little bit here. Amen.
It's okay.
Jesus was a pretty good philosopher, right? He was the greatest philosopher. When he says in Matthew 7:1, judge not lest ye be judged, he was not saying you cannot judge an action to be immoral and not in conformity with the good of human nature. Because a few verses after that, he tells us precisely how to do the judging. He says, before you take the speck out of your brother's eye, well, that implies we've got to make a judgment. There's a speck there. You're doing something bad, right? He says, before you take the speck out of your brother's eye, take the log out of your own eye. So Jesus is not saying you cannot judge behaviors to be immoral. He's simply saying when you do, you make sure you're first a credible witness. Amen? Because if you're not first a credible witness, well, you're just talking to the air, brother. Because that person ain't going to give a flip about what you say if you're not first a credible witness. And what Jesus is trying to teach us and lead us to is to have a generous attitude toward people because we can't judge their motives, right? Just as the Father has a merciful and generous attitude toward us, so too we must have to others. And that is what Jesus is teaching us in Matthew chapter 7. So much for the judgmental argument. I have one more argument that we'll consider, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And that is the intolerance argument, which is very similar to the judgmental argument, but the argument is pretty much in the same form. It's intolerant to say that a belief is false or a behavior is immoral. You're being intolerant when you do that. Notice the implication of that statement. The implication is tolerance means to accept everyone's belief and opinion as equal and valid. And if you do not accept everyone's opinion as equal and valid and thus equally true, well then you're not being tolerant, you're being intolerant, right? First of all, my response is, well, wait a minute. If we ought to be tolerant according to your understanding of tolerance, doesn't that at least imply one absolute moral truth? Namely, we ought to be tolerant, and thus moral relativism is false, you see? So that would be my first response. Secondly, let's concede for argument's sake that tolerance means what the relativist thinks it means. Namely, we ought to accept all beliefs and opinions as equally true, equally valid. Well, that's problematic, folks. You know why? Because there are some beliefs that are contradictory of each other. Some say God exists. Some say God does not exist. There is no middle ground there. These two options elucidate all of the possibilities of reality. Either God exists or he doesn't exist. And the intellect, the very nature of the intellect or the mind recognizes that both cannot be true based upon that principle that I mentioned earlier. Remember that principle of non-contradiction? Something cannot be both be true. Something cannot both be and not be in the same respect, the same place and time. Well, when I consider God exists versus God doesn't exist, I immediately recognize both can't be true. One's going to have to be false, and the other's going to have to be true. So by virtue of the very nature of the mind and how it relates to being or reality, we can conclude that it is impossible to be highfalutin, sophisticated. It's metaphysically impossible, right? It's impossible to affirm that we must accept all beliefs as equally true, because some beliefs are actually contradictory of each other. And given the nature of the mind, we cannot affirm contradictory positions as both being true. Secondly, conceding for argument's sake that tolerance means we must accept everyone's belief as equally true. Well, why don't you accept my belief as equally true? Why don't you accept my belief that moral relativism is false as equally true to your belief that moral relativism is true? Did you catch that? Because if we have to be tolerant in the way that the relativist thinks we must be tolerant, well, then the relativist is going to have to accept whatever I believe as equally true to what he believes. But if that were the case, he wouldn't be making the argument in the first place, right? And finally, watch this. Rather than the relativistic position affirming and protecting and promoting tolerance, the relativistic position actually undermines tolerance. How so? It does so in this way. I could possibly believe that intolerance is a good for all human beings. That intolerance is an actual good according to my belief system, right? Well, if relativism is true, then my relativist friend has to once again accept my belief that intolerance is a good thing. But of course, my relativist friend doesn't want to make that conclusion because he started out saying you ought not to be intolerant. So the argument from intolerance on concession that we take for granted what the relativist thinks tolerance is, it does not stand up to the scrutiny of reason. And it is not a reasonable argument to affirm moral relativism and or total relativism. And then I'd finally respond in this way. There's even a more fundamental problem with the intolerance argument. Namely, it simply misunderstands tolerance. Recall that the intolerance argument understands tolerance to mean we must accept everyone's belief and opinion as equally true. But that's not what tolerance is, folks. Tolerance means I will allow you to believe, to make truth claims, to make ethical claims, free from the threat of physical coercion, even though I disagree with you, right? That's the essence of tolerance. I recognize your dignity as a human being. I recognize that by virtue of being a human being, nature directs you to pursue the truth, to exercise your freedom to pursue the truth. And I, as a human being, must exercise my freedom in a way that allows you to exercise your freedom to achieve the things that are going to perfect you as a human being, insofar as you are a human being, right? And so I have to allow that. And even though I disagree with what you say, the way the world really works, I tolerate that view because I respect your dignity as a human being. I tolerate it in the sense that I'm not going to physically coerce you to believe what I believe. Does that make sense? Just because I make an ethical claim or I make a claim about reality, it doesn't follow that I have to physically coerce you to believe my claims. True tolerance is to recognize the dignity of the human being, allow them to make their claims about reality free of the threat of physical coercion while at the same time disagreeing with them. But notice what my relativist friend does. My relativist friend slaps me with the label of intolerance for disagreeing with someone But disagreeing with someone belongs to the essence of tolerance. So fundamentally, the intolerance argument actually misunderstands what tolerance is. So even if we can see tolerance to mean what my friend thinks it means, the argument does not work, and there are ways to respond to it. But more fundamentally, it just misses the mark because it misunderstands tolerance. So, brothers and sisters, hopefully you can see that there are ways by which we can critique relativism in its total form and even in its moral form, and thus conclude at least that there is absolute truth. Whatever that is, we still got to do some work, right? But at least that there is objective truth for us to come to know, that there is absolute moral truths that we can come to know. That's an important first step in our intellectual inquiry, in our inquiry as human beings, to figure out what is reality and how the heck to live in accord with it. It's as basic as that. So notice that this stuff is not just for the ivory towery, highfalutin academic exercises, as fun as the academic exercises are. It actually pertains to real life. Thought determines action. So we got to get the thinking straight in order to get the acting straight, right? Sanity leads to sanctity. Intellect, will, knowledge, love. So these are ways by which we can critique relativism and ways by which we can counter some of the arguments that relativists pose to us. Amen? I'm done.